Chapter 1 of Atlantis. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Margaret S. Bayat. Atlantis by Gerhard Hauptmann. Translated by Adele and Thomas Seltzer. Chapter 1. The German fast mail steamer Roland, one of the older vessels of the North German Steamship Company, flying between Bremen and New York, left Bremen on the 23rd of January, 1892. It had been built in English yards with none of those profuse, gorgeous gold decorations in a riotous Rococo style, which are so unpleasant in the saloons and cabins of ships more recently built in German yards. The crew of the vessel included the captain, 4 officers, 2 engineers of the first rank, assistant engineers, firemen, coal passers, oilers, a purser, the head steward and the second steward, the chef, the second cook, and the doctor. In addition to these men with their assistants, to whom the well-being of that tremendous floating household was entrusted, there were, of course, a number of sailors, stewards, stewardesses, workers in the kitchen, and so on, besides 2 cabin boys and a nurse. There was also an officer in charge of the mail on board. The vessel was carrying only 100 cabin passengers from Bremen, but in the steerage there were 400 human beings. Friedrich von Kammacher, to whom the day before the Roland had been non-existent, telegraphed from Paris to have a cabin on it reserved for him. Haste was imperative. After receiving notification from the company that the cabin was being held, he had only an hour and a half in which to catch the express that would bring him to Havre at about 12 o'clock. From Havre he crossed to Southampton, spending the night in a bunk in one of those wretched saloons in which a number of persons are herded together. But he managed to sleep the whole time, and the crossing went without incident. At dawn he was on deck, watching England's ghostly coastline draw nearer and nearer, until finally the steamer entered the port of Southampton, where he was to await the Roland. At the steamship office he was told that the Roland would scarcely make Southampton before evening, and at 7 o'clock a tender would be at the pier to convey the passengers to the ship as soon as it was sighted. That meant 12 idle hours in a dreary foreign town, with the thermometer at 10 degrees below freezing point. Frederick decided to take a room in a hotel and, if possible, pass some of the time in sleep. In a shop window he saw a display of cigarettes of the brand of Simon Arzt of Port Said. He entered the shop, which a maid was sweeping, and bought several hundred. It was an act dictated by sentiment rather than a desire for enjoyment. The cigarettes of Simon Arzt of Port Said were excellent, the best he had ever smoked, but the significance they had acquired for him was not due to any intrinsic virtue of theirs. He carried an alligator portfolio in his waistcoat pocket. In that portfolio, among other things, was a letter he had received the very day he left Paris. Dear Frederick, it's no use. I left the sanatorium in the Harz and returned to my parents' home a lost man. That cursed winter in the Heuscheuer Mountains. After a stay in tropical countries, I should not have thrown myself into the fangs of such a winter. Of course, the worst thing was my predecessor's fur coat. To my predecessor's fur coat I owe my sweet fate. May the devil in hell take special delight in burning it. I need scarcely tell you that I gave myself copious injections of tuberculin and spat a considerable number of bacilli, but enough remained behind to provide me with a speedy exitus letalis. Now for the essential. I must settle my bequests. I find I owe you 3,000 marks. You made it possible for me to complete my medical studies. To be sure, they have failed me miserably, but that, of course, you cannot help. And, curiously enough, now that all's lost, the thing that most bothers me is the horrid thought that I cannot repay you. My father, you know, is principal of a public school, and actually managed to save some money, but he has 5 children beside myself, all of whom are unprovided for. He looked upon me as his capital, which would bring more than the usual rate of interest. Being a practical man, he now realizes he has lost both principal and interest. In brief, he is afraid of responsibilities which, unfortunately, I cannot shoulder in the better world to come. Fo, 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 I spit 3 times. What shall I do? Would you be able to forego the payment of my rent? Several times, old boy, I have been 2/3 of the way over already, and I have left for you some notes on the states I have passed through, which may not be lacking in scientific interest. Should it be possible for me, after the great moment, to make myself noticeable from the beyond, you will hear from me again. Where are you? Goodbye. In the vivid, flashing orgies of my nocturnal dreams, you are always tossing in a ship on the high seas. Do you intend to go on an ocean trip? It is January. Isn't there a certain advantage in not needing to dread April weather any longer? I shake hands with you, Frederick von Kammacher. Yours, George Rasmussen. Frederick, of course, had immediately sent a telegram from Paris, which relieved the son, dying a heroic death from solicitude for his hale father. Though Frederick von Kammacher had profound troubles of his own to occupy his mind, his thoughts kept recurring to the letter in his pocket and his dying friend. To an imaginative person of 30, his life of the past few years is in an eminent degree present to his mind. There had been a tragic turn in Frederick's own life, and now tragedy had also entered his friend's life, a tragedy far more awful. The 2 young men had been separated for a number of years. They had met again and passed a number of happy weeks together, enriched by a liberal exchange of ideas. Those weeks were the beginning of similar epochs in the career of each. It was at little winter festivities in Frederick von Kammacher's comfortable home that the cigarettes of Simon Arzt of Port Said, which Rasmussen had brought from the place of their manufacture, had played their role. Now, in the reading room of Hoffmann's Hotel near the harbor, he wrote him a letter. Dear old George, my fingers are clammy. I am constantly dipping a broken pen in moldy ink, but if I don't write to you now, you won't get any news of me for 3 weeks. This evening, I board the Roland of the North German Steamship Company. There seems to be something in your dreams. Nobody could have told you of my trip. 2 hours before I started, I myself knew nothing of it. Day after tomorrow, it will be a year since you came to us direct from Bremen after your second journey with a trunk full of stories, photographs, and the cigarettes of Simon Arzt. I had scarcely set foot in England when, 20 paces from the landing place, I beheld our beloved brand in a shop window. Of course I bought some, by wholesale in fact, and am smoking one while writing, for the sake of auld lang syne. Unfortunately, this horrible reading room in which I am writing doesn't get any the warmer, no matter how many cigarettes I light. You were with us 2 weeks when fate came and knocked at the door. We both rushed to the door and caught a cold, it seems. As for me, I have sold my house, given up my practice, and put my 3 children in a boarding school. As for my wife, you know what has befallen her. The devil. Sometimes it makes one creepy to think of the past. To both of us it seemed a splendid thing for you to take over our colleague's practice. I can see you dashing about to visit your patients in his sleigh and fur coat, and when he died, I had not the slightest objection to your settling down as a country physician in the immediate vicinity, although we had always poked a lot of fun at a country physician's starvation practice. Now things have turned out very differently. Do you remember with what an endless number of monotonous jokes the goldfinches that fairly overran the Heuscholle Mountains used to furnish us? When we approached a bare bush or tree, it would suddenly sway to and fro and scatter gold leaves. We interpreted that as meaning mountains of gold. In the evening we dined on goldfinches, because the hunters who went out on Sundays sold them in great quantities, and my tippling cook cooked them deliciously. At that time you swore you would not remain a physician. You were not to live from the pockets of poor patients. The state was to salary you and put at your disposal a huge store of provisions so that you could supply your impoverished patients with flour, wine, meat, and necessities. And now, in token of its gratitude, the evil demon of the medical guild has dealt you this blow. But you must get well again. I'm off for America. When we see each other again, you will learn why. I can be of no use to my wife. With Binswanger, she is in excellent hands. 3 weeks ago, when I visited her, she did not even recognize me. I have finished forever with my profession and my medical and bacteriological studies. I have had ill luck, you know. My scientific reputation has been torn to shreds. They say it was fuzz instead of the exciting organism of anthrax that I examined in a dye and wrote about. Perhaps, but I don't think so. At any rate, the thing is a matter of indifference to me. Sometimes I am thoroughly disgusted with the clownish tricks the world plays upon us, and I feel an approach to English spleen. Nearly the whole world, or at least Europe, has turned into a cold dish on a station lunch counter, and I have no appetite for it. He wound up with cordial lines to his dying friend, and handed the letter to a German porter to mail. In his room the temperature was icy, the window panes frozen over. Without undressing, he lay down in one of the 2 vast, chilly beds. At best, the frame of mind of a traveler with a night's journey behind him and an ocean crossing ahead of him is not enviable. Frederick's condition was aggravated by a whirl of painful, partially warring recollections, which crowded into his mind, jostling and pushing one another aside in a ceaseless chase. For the sake of storing up strength for the events to come, he would gladly have gone to sleep, but as he lay there, whether with open or closed eyes, he saw past events with vivid clearness. The young man's career from his 20th to his 30th year had not departed from the conventional lines of his class. Ambition and great aptitude in his specialty had won him the protection of eminent scientists. He had been Professor Koch's assistant, and without a rupture of their friendly relations, had also studied several semesters under Koch's opponent, Koch, in Munich. When he went to Rome for the purpose of investigating malaria, he met Mrs. Thorne and her daughter, who later became his wife, and whose mind was now deranged. Angèle Thorne brought him a considerable addition to his own small fortune. The delicacy of her constitution caused him, eventually, to move with her and the 3 children that had come to them to a healthy mountain district, but the change did not interfere with his scientific work or professional connections. Thus it was that in Munich, Berlin, and other scientific centers, he had been considered one of the most competent bacteriologists, a man whose career had passed the stage of the problematical. The worst against him, and that only in the opinion of the cut and dried among his fellow scientists, who shook their heads doubtfully, had been a certain belletristic tendency. Now, however, that his abortive work had appeared and he had suffered his great defeat, all serious scientists said it was the cultivation of side interests that had weakened his strength and led the promising young intellect along the path of self-destruction. In his icy room in the English hotel, Frederick meditated on his past. I see 3 threads which the Parsi have woven into my life. The snapping of the thread that represents my scientific career leaves me utterly indifferent. The bloody tearing of the other thread, he had in mind his love for his wife, makes the first event insignificant. But even though I should still hold a place among the most hopeful of the younger generation of scientists, the 3rd thread, which is still whole, which pierces my soul like a live wire, would have nullified my ambitions and all my endeavors in science. The third thread was a passion. Friedrich von Kammacher had gone to Paris to rid himself of this passion, but the object of it, the 16-year-old daughter of a Swedish teacher of stage dancing, held him in bondage against his will. His love had turned into a disease which had reached an acute stage, probably because the gloomy events of so recent occurrence had induced in him a state in which men are peculiarly susceptible to love's poison. It was a friend of his, a physician, who had introduced him in Berlin to the girl and her father, and who later, when sufficiently acquainted with Frederick's secret, raging love, had to take it upon himself to inform the enamored man of every change in the couple's address. Dr. von Kammacher's scanty luggage did not indicate careful preparation for a long trip. In a fit of desperation, or rather in an outburst of passion, he had made the hasty decision to catch the Roland at Southampton when he learned that the Swede and his daughter had embarked on it at Bremen on the 23rd of January. End of chapter 1.